Thank you so much to Lakshmi, Robin, and everyone who has helped make this event so wonderful. It is great to be here. My name is Danya Lagos, and I am here to present some of the research that I've been working on about this question of, has there been a transgender tipping point? So it is commonly known that attitudes and opportunities related to gender and what gender means can change over time. However, what I'm asking in today's presentation is, can patterns of social change shift the distribution of gender itself? In the mid-2010s, there was a media narrative in magazines like Time, National Geographic, the New York Times, suggesting that American society and other societies within its orbit had reached a transgender tipping point. And actress Laverne Cox was quoted as saying, "We are getting to a point in time where more and more people are saying, this is who I am transgender." And so it is a claim about not only increased civil rights, increased media visibility, but also increased prevalence of a way of identifying with gender. So this leads us to a question of, does an increase in visibility and civil rights also lead to an increase in the number of people who come to identify as transgender? And here, this question might echo the question posed by John D'Amelio in his 1983 essay, Capitalism and Gay Identity, where he argued that over time, the conditions of capitalism were actually responsible for creating a series of opportunities for people to come to identify as gay that were not, or gay and lesbian, and that were not possible in pre-capitalist societies, and that reality came not with a condemnation of gay identity, but as a series of radical opportunities to then take this and forge bonds of solidarity and realize the material underpinnings of sexual life and sexual rights. This narrative hits a few snags along the way. So over time, in arguments made before the Supreme Court, as with the Obergefell case, an assumption was made in the claims about civil rights that sexual and gender minorities are born this way, that being gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender or queer in some way is a trait that is randomly distributed in populations. Now, this claim, while successful and leveraged by many mainstream LGBT organizations, caught the attention of anti-trans activists, people who would seek to exclude transgender people from public life, and they used their perceptions, which was at odds of this random distribution. They made the claim, well, it doesn't seem random to me. They used the perceived increase in trans identification in recent cohorts, and they're saying, well, if it's more present in younger cohorts, this does not seem like a random distribution to me. And in recent books published by anti-trans activist Abigail Schreier, she even points to a specific issue that transgender identity is a craze, using the language of pandemics and epidemics, that young children are being, she refers to this flight from womanhood that is particularly attracting people who are assigned female at birth to identify as trans men because being a woman is stigmatized. So she points to what she perceives as it mainly being a surge among people assigned female at birth to suggest, well, this is not seeming like a random distribution to me. So in addition to discriminating against people who are trans, a shift recently, as civil rights law has changed and adapted, a goal has shifted to preventing people from becoming trans in the first place, if it's not as easy anymore to discriminate against trans people directly. So here are some concepts that I'm going to use to talk about what we're looking at here. I'm going to borrow from Doug McAdams' concept of biographical availability, and this refers to the absence of personal constraints that may increase the costs and risks of movement participation. And his research was focused mainly in the Freedom Summer in the 1960s. So what attracted young people to go and participate in the Freedom Summer rides? And he found that, gender, having children, put people in a particular position that made it harder or participate. Victor mentioned things that make activism much harder as a parent, as an academic, on the tenure track, etc. So this is the concept that I'm referring to throughout the talk. And I want to distinguish here between identity and identification. So identity being an attribute that is present or inscribed in individuals as they navigate in society, versus identification, which is an aspect of individuals' senses of self that can be activated or negotiated within historical, material, and social contexts of opportunity and constraint. So even people who are not born Americans become sometimes Americans. And so this is a process of identification. It is not simply present in someone and is observed by other people. So the data that I work with come from the CDC's Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, given the very attractive name BRFIS sometimes. And the BRFIS started collecting in 2014. It started asking people a flawed but important question: are you transgender? And if people answered yes, they would then get asked another series of questions, which was, do you identify as female to male, male to female, or gender nonconforming? And they had to choose one of these options. Now, this is not how I would have designed the survey, but it still provides us something to work with. And so over the 2014 and 2019 administrations of the data that I'm working with, there are 39 states in the United States that have provided this question because it's administered by the states, but as part of a federal effort. And so while there are some notable absences, I do think that there's a wide distribution of states in terms of political composition, in terms of racial ethnic composition, in terms of what their labor markets might look like, et cetera. And so this yielded a pretty good sample of 4,604 transgender and gender nonconforming respondents, but it also allowed us a comparably recruited sample in over 800,000 respondents. But I want to talk a little bit, I want to step back from the data and put us in the context of how transgender history has unfolded in the United States. So there have been people who have identified with a variety of identities that are not understood as cisgender today throughout US history. But these are some of the main inflection points that historians like Susan Stryker and Jules Gill Peterson have identified, and C. Riley Snorton as well. So in 1952, this was considered the first big media sensation about a transgender person. Christine Jorgensen made sex change a household term at the time. There was also this riot in San Francisco, which was a precursor of Stonewall that was primarily working class people, including working class people of color who were being harassed at their hangout spot by the police and decided to fight back. In 1973, so in this post-Stonewall moment, there was a schism between trans activists and the gay liberation movement and the women's movements, including activists like Sylvia Rivera being prevented from speaking at the 1973 Christopher Street Parade, which was the main precursor to Pride events as we know them now. And then in 1993, there was a high-profile murder of a person named Brandon Teena, which within the community of lesbians and transgender men created what was known then as the border wars. Another event that I want to call attention to is the events of 9/11, which provoked a huge increase in the importance of legal documents and the foundation of legal efforts to make it more possible for transgender people to change legal documents. So what does this history that I've outlined here very loosely mean? I have data from people born from 1935 through 2001 because it was a survey of US adults, and they stopped measuring age at 80, unfortunately, but they also only measured people who were 18 and older. And so here, I want to walk us through loosely how the ages that people would have been at the time of these events, because I think it's important. So someone born in this initial cohort here, when Christine Jorgensen's name became a household name, they would have been, around 10 years old. Someone born in 1945 would have been a child, but maybe their parents would have heard of Christine Jorgensen. And they would have been, coming of age at around the Compton's cafeteria riot, would have been in their 20s during the rupture with gay and lesbian movements. They would have been in their 30s at the beginning of the AIDS pandemic. So these are all events, for brevity, I'm not going through them one by one. But as we see, people experience time differently depending on when they were alive. So I have a few theories about what might look different in terms of, are there generational differences? And so here's one theory. If we take the narrative that, there is an arc of history, but it is bending ever slowly towards justice, perhaps it will be a linear increase in social acceptance, which will lead over time to more people slowly identifying as trans once the conditions of the closet and expected cisnormativity are eased. So one could expect that this would be a linear change. Another theory, so the data do permit us to distinguish between people who identify as trans men, as trans women, and as gender nonconforming. Very unfortunately, there is not a lot of nuance. There is a lot of overlap between these categories. Not everyone who is a transgender man or is a transgender woman would characterize themselves as gender conforming. But these are the categories that the CDC collected, and that is what I'm working with. But because transgender might be considered an older or more established category, I predicted that maybe people in each cohort will identify as transgender at higher levels than people who identify as gender nonconforming. And so another theory was looking at the written history by trans historiographers. Early history used to suggest that trans women received more media coverage and had more advanced treatment in terms of medicalized transition at their disposal than trans men, but this might have actually really changed at some point, including in the 1980s and 1990s, which were a point where historians remarked that there was an increase in visibility for trans men. So I predict here that there will be at some point a convergence of identification patterns. And so because of this media coverage, and my theory here is that media coverage does influence identification at some point, my theory was that because the subjects of the media coverage in the 1950s and later on into the late 20th century were primarily white, that the people who came of age in these cohorts there might be higher identification as trans among people who are white than people who are not white. If we take the hypothesis that representation influences the possibilities available to us, maybe this will also be a point of convergence, or maybe there will be a disparity that continues. And same for education. So because transgender as a category, really is associated with queer theory, perhaps earlier cohorts will be the more college educated compared to now where the media and the internet are democratizing identification patterns. Maybe this will also be a pattern of convergence. So what do I find? Overall, so there was not a linear relationship here. I'm presenting in blue people who identify as transgender, in red people who identify as transgender nonconforming. The dashed lines are the 95% confidence intervals, and the dots are the predicted probabilities. And statistically, we don't actually see a very big change between cohorts born between 1935 and 1984. It is actually the only significant rise is in cohorts born after 1985, and then especially in cohorts born after 1995. So there does seem to be a tipping point of sorts. It is not a gradual increase. And so while transgender identity is significantly more common than gender nonconforming identity, both have reflected this tipping point increase. There hasn't been a gradual change for one and no change or a tipping point for the other. Both really correspond to this tipping point among people born after 1985. But one thing that is interesting to me is that, so there was no information, unfortunately, about sex assigned at birth for gender nonconforming people. Because of the way the question was worded in terms of are you male to female, female to male, there were ways to get sex assigned at birth and gender identification. And one thing that I found here was a convergence in the trends, that while numbers were higher among people assigned male at birth, over time we do see a convergence, and so now there are basically statistically just as likely to be trans men as there are trans women. Even though in earlier cohorts, but before 1985, there were more likely to be trans women than trans men. Now, when we turn to look at the role of race and ethnicity, on the left is transgender identification, on the right is gender nonconforming identification. Here I did not have a large enough sample to disaggregate between Black and Hispanic and Native American and Asian, so I used work from the color line to conceptualize of a white, non-white difference. Hopefully in the future more data will make it easier to disaggregate. But I did find this pattern interesting. I was wrong when I hypothesized that greater representation would correspond to greater prevalence. There's actually been more prevalence of transgender identity among non-white people in all of these earlier cohorts than among white people. It is actually only the tipping point that then makes it a predominantly, or not predominantly, I don't want to use that word. Now in more recent cohorts, people who are white are more likely to be transgender than people who are not white, which calls into question a lot of things about what representation is doing. Has representation changed? And is it really leading to the opening of possibilities? And here's one finding that I think has a lot of potential political significance. It's actually always been people who don't go to college who are more likely to identify as transgender than people who do go to college. So all of this rhetoric pointed at, college professors and their queer theory are really, working the crowd and, stirring a gender revolution. Unfortunately, we are not that successful. So, this is I think something that there's a lot left to unpack here, but I'm going to move on to the implications. So what we're seeing in terms of sex assigned at birth, we're seeing a convergence, a lowered relevance of sex assigned at birth to gender possibilities. It is not a craze. It is just that sex assigned at birth is less relevant than it ever has been in terms of identifying as transgender. Visibility does not always translate to growth. And college attendance consistently predicts lower trans identifications. It's no surprise to anyone to hear that there are a lot of barriers to attending college, that being, a trans person in a K-12 environment would close the doors towards. And so it is not the professors, something else is going on, and it doesn't seem to be the role of education either. But what are the implications for civil rights frameworks in terms of the master's tools? There have been victories used getting this essentialist argument about random distribution. I think that we can find other types of civil rights frameworks that work, like from things that are not randomly distributed, like language and religion, that are still protected in some way. It does not need to be immutable and randomly distributed to be defended as part of something we value. And so that's really what I want to encourage people to take away from this, is that there are ways to argue successfully for trans rights and gender self-determination that find common cause in religion and language. Language is something that people can change, which might be it makes it different from gender. But I hope that we see here that there are other frameworks other than this kind of immutability. And I also hope that it helps us to embrace identification, to look at conditions for the possibility of trans thriving, and to dream big about a better world for gender self-determination for all. Thank you.